Hello, my name is Michael Hattem, and I'm here to talk to you about my new book, Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution. And I'd like to thank you for joining me and my fellow authors here at the History Summit. Past and Prologue is a book about how the revolutionary generation created what we have thought of ever since as quote-unquote American history, and the role that it played in the politics of the revolution. The central question behind the book is that of national identity in the American Revolution. And that is, how did colonists go from thinking of themselves as British subjects to thinking of themselves as American citizens? Before 1760, there's really no such thing as quote-unquote American history. Most British colonists thought of the British past as their own. But by 1800, that's really no longer the case, and that is a significant transformation. How does a society go about discarding a previously shared past and create a new one to replace it? And how do they do that amidst the upheaval and instability of revolution? And so my book tells the story of this transformation by looking at how colonists reconsidered their relationship to the British past, how they created a newly shared colonial past, and after the war, how they created a deep national past or a sense of American antiquity. And fundamentally, my book argues that these changing historical memories are really necessary to understand both the coming of the American Revolution and the origins of American national identity. Instead of trying to summarize the entire book, I'd like to share some stories and primary sources. So let me start by telling you a little bit about the book's origins. The project was originally intended to explore British historical memory in the colonies before 1776. But while I was doing research in the John Jay papers at the New York Historical Society, I found a 550-page manuscript whose cover page read, "History of the American Revolution." And under that, there was a notation that said, "Found among the papers of Governor William Livingston." Well, I'd worked on Livingston, and I knew that he hadn't written a history of the Revolution, so I started trying to figure out just what this was. After transcribing most of it and analyzing the text and the handwriting, I discovered that it was an early draft manuscript of the first 6 chapters of David Ramsay's History of the American Revolution, which is the most popular historical work of the early Republic. After identifying it, I was able to compare this early draft with the final published version, which came out about 5 years later in 1790. And the biggest change was really in the first chapter, which in the draft spent a lot of time recounting the history of England in the 17th century. But in the published version, that was largely cut out and was replaced with sort of individual histories of the various colonies' settlement and development. And it was finding that manuscript and the changes in it that convinced me to enlarge the scope of my project to include the early national period and to focus on the broader process exemplified by the changes in Ramsay's manuscript and the question that it raised, which was, when and how did Americans stop thinking of the British past as their own and create quote-unquote American history to replace it? One of the key arguments in the first half of the book, which deals with the coming of the Revolution, is that Parliament's passing of unprecedented legislation in the 1760s, like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, had a big cultural impact on many colonists, namely that they began to think about the British past differently. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 had ended the tyranny of the Stuart monarchs and established a constitutional monarchy with a significant expansion of the powers of Parliament. This, combined with the creation of the Board of Trade and the national debt and the expansion of the Navy, really laid the foundation for the British Empire's success in the 18th century. And for that reason, it played a really fundamental role in most Britain's civic identity, both in Britain and in the colonies. In that sense, it was not unlike how many Americans have long related to the American Revolution, seeing the principles it established as the foundation on which the nation was built and should always proceed from. But when Parliament began to pass all kinds of unprecedented legislation, and colonists realized that there was no one else to appeal to, they started to see the Glorious Revolution differently. Their experiences in the 1760s and the 1770s really called into question the meaning of an event that had been fundamental to their civic identity as subjects of the most successful empire in the world. They came to see the Glorious Revolution not as having achieved some ideal balance between king and parliament, but instead as having simply reversed their roles and created the circumstances in which a parliament could act as arbitrarily and tyrannically as any 17th century monarchy. This development in the 1760s has some contemporary resonance in that many Americans today are broadly reconsidering the American Revolution, the validity of its ideals, and the usefulness of its legacy in our civic lives and culture. We can see this changed interpretation of the Glorious Revolution in a map, biographical, and historical chart created in 1810 by David Ramsay. I first saw this while doing research at the American Philosophical Society, and it is huge. When they brought it out, it covered the entire table. Later, through his letters, I found out that he created these with the idea of selling them to schools, and that he charged extra for charts that were already colored, and he had his teenage daughters do the coloring. You can see in the historical chart that many of the original colonies enjoyed what Ramsay called free government until 1688, at which point they effectively lost their independence. This goes back to Americans rethinking of the Glorious Revolution during the 1760s and 1770s, and coming to see it as allowing Parliament to exercise arbitrary power over the colonies, and creating the situation that led to the declaring of independence, which we can see marked on the map. So the narrative that Ramsay's map is telling is that the revolution was actually about regaining something that had been lost, not about creating something entirely new. And that is a very conservative interpretation of the revolution, and one that I found in Ramsay's own histories and many others from the period. But why were they promoting a conservative narrative of the revolution and the new nation's origins? Historians and others who address these historical themes use their narratives and interpretations to support the authority of the new federal government. By creating this narrative of independence lost and regained, these writers made it so that independence represented continuity rather than rupture. This new colonial past effectively de-radicalized the revolution at a time when cultural nationalists sought to help rein in the popular spirit unleashed by the revolution, and that was evident in rebellions against the new state governments, like Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts and the Whiskey Rebellion in western Pennsylvania. In both of those cases, the participants adopted revolutionary rhetoric in support of their popular actions. And at the same time, many other Americans were trying to justify their calls for more democratic post-revolutionary reforms by linking them to the spirit of '76. All of this really highlighted the need for cultural nationalists to make the past less co-optable by the discontented. So they promoted a historical narrative that would characterize the revolution and the nation's origins as having been about recovering something that was lost, rather than portraying the revolution as a spontaneous popular uprising, like these post-revolutionary rebellions. It's really an attempt to not only change how people thought about the revolution, but also to limit who could and could not claim its legacy. And that is an example of how these new narratives and interpretations of the past were interrelated with the politics of both the imperial crisis in the 1760s and 1770s, and after the war in the 1780s and 1790s. And it's also an example of how the narratives influenced one another over time. Cultural nationalists in the early republic spread these narratives in a variety of ways, including through print and institutions. Print really exploded in the early national period. There were more newspapers, more books, more pamphlets being printed than ever before, and they all needed content. And historical content was really prominent in all of them. In fact, it's in the post-war period that we start to see the first American poetry and fiction and painting, and historical themes were the foundation for many of these emerging American cultural forms. Newspapers excerpted and serialized entire multi-volume histories over long stretches of time, including the first history of the Revolution by William Gordon, which was published in 1788. Newspaper printers did this partly because they felt that serializing these histories had civic value, and while many ordinary people could not afford to buy many books, these serializations gave their histories a much wider audience than they would have had otherwise. Another benefit for printers was that serializing an important historical work turned their newspaper, at least temporarily, into a collectible item rather than an ephemeral item. People would be sure to buy each new issue because they wanted to continue reading these serialized works of history. And we can see the value that printers put on this practice in an issue of the Vermont Gazette from 1784, which began serializing a history of the Revolutionary War written by a British clergyman. There were no histories of the Revolution written by an American yet in 1784, and this printer clearly thought that this would be the next best option to satisfy his readership's desire to read about their own recent history. But on top of that, look at the header. It's effectively a second masthead for the book itself on the second page of the paper. This printer subverted the standard design of a newspaper to include and to feature this serialization, and that speaks to the value that the printer expected it to have for his readers. These narratives were also spread through institutions, including the nation's first historical societies and natural history museums. The first natural history museum was Charles Willson Peale's museum in Philadelphia, which opened in his home in the early 1780s and later moved to Independence Hall. Peale had been a highly regarded portrait painter before the war, and in his museum, he capitalized on the growing interest in natural history or the history of the land. He collected specimens of animals and plants indigenous to North America and put them on display. He offered public events, tours for school children, and even a small research library. We can see the museum in this painting by Peale and in another by his son Rembrandt of what was called the Long Room. You can see the rows of ornately gold-framed portraits of Revolutionary War heroes along the top of the wall. By juxtaposing the portraits of important civic figures with the natural specimens, Peale created a visual connection in his visitors' minds between the land and the new nation. What Peale was doing here was nationalizing natural history, nationalizing the history of the land. In the 1790s and 1800s, natural history museums would spring up in many American cities, and almost all of them followed Peale's lead in the style and purpose of his display. By connecting the history of the new nation to the ancient immemorial history of the land itself, Peale and others created a sense of a deep national past that transcended the nation's British origins. And again, we can see how both before and after the war, historical narratives and interpretations were interrelated with the political circumstances of the time, and that each helped shape the other. Past and Prologue uncovers a host of these connections, and I hope you'll join me in my exploration of the American Revolution and the politics surrounding the creation of American history. I hope readers of Past and Prologue will come away from the book with a better appreciation of how history shapes the present, and vice versa, and specifically how that worked during the Revolution. I hope they'll come away more equipped to be aware of when specific narratives of the past are being used and to ask why and for whom. When a reader hears people complaining that history is being politicized by some person or group, they should know that American history has always been political in the United States. It can't not be political, because that's not a bug, it's a feature of American history. And finally, I hope readers will come away from Past and Prologue understanding that American history is not a neutral, objective term, but that it actually represents something that was originally constructed, and that revising how we think about the past and our own history is an American tradition that played a crucial role in the founding of the nation. Thank you for joining me here at the History Summit. Historians are keenly attuned to the role of history in our contemporary society and politics, but we don't often think about its role in the past and on our historical subjects. Before 1760, most British American colonists thought of the British past as their history. But by 1800, that was no longer the case. Past and Prologue explores this dramatic transformation. Rather than liberating Americans from the past, as many historians have argued, the Revolution actually made the past matter more than ever before. Past and Prologue is a story about the creation of American history, and of how the process of reinterpreting and revising the past played a critical role in the founding of the Republic.